Has it all been worth it? The badness of suffering casts doubt on the goodness of the world. Despite making some brutal claims, Williams writes, Nietzsche had a hypersensitivity to suffering. It was linked to a total refusal to forget not only the existence of suffering, but the fact that suffering was necessary to everything that he and anyone else valued. All good things come from bad things. It's one of his fundamental tenets. On this view, since the world's achievements and glories, art, self-understanding, nobility of character, cannot, in common honesty, be separated from the knowledge of the horrors that have been involved in bringing these things about, there is a question that cannot, Nietzsche supposed, simply be ignored: whether it has all been worth it. In asking whether human history has been worth it, we are asking whether the horrors and the suffering have been outweighed so that human history has been, on the whole, good. Pessimists answer no. On their view, human existence is on the whole bad or worse than nothing. Buddha's first noble truth is that life is mostly suffering. And Silenus said, "It is best not to be born." Nietzsche sometimes makes such claims. If someone had full knowledge of the conscious lives of others, Nietzsche writes, he would despair of the value of life and collapse with a curse on existence. Williams similarly writes that if we had such knowledge, this would be an ultimate horror, an unendurable nightmare. If for a moment we got anything like an adequate idea of it, and we really guided our actions by it, then surely we would annihilate the planet if we could. And if other planets containing conscious creatures are similar to ours in the suffering they contain, we would annihilate them as well. Nietzsche later struggled to avoid this form of pessimism. One of Nietzsche's responses was his attempt to make the world good by saying yes to everything. In other passages, Nietzsche claims instead that we cannot intelligibly ask whether it has all been worth it. In his words, judgments of value concerning life, for it or against it, can never be true. The value of life cannot be estimated, not by the living, for they are an interested party, not by the dead, for a different reason. Nietzsche here assumes that if we try to estimate the value of our lives, our judgment would be distorted by self-interest. That may sometimes happen. When Nietzsche tried to believe that suffering is good, so that his own suffering would be easier to bear, Nietzsche's judgment was distorted by self-interest. But when we believe that suffering is bad, our judgment is not distorted in this way. The world, Nietzsche writes, has no value at all, for there is nothing against which it could be measured, and in relation to which the word value would have meaning. The total value of the world is unevaluable. Consequently, philosophical pessimism is among the comical things. This argument assumes that when we ask whether something's existence is good, we can only compare this thing's existence with the existence of something else and ask which is better. That is not so. We can ask whether something's existence is in itself good. Such judgments are comparative only in the minimal sense that we compare this thing's existence with its non-existence, which we can regard as nothing and as having no value. Something's existence is in itself good if it is better than nothing, and bad if it is worse than nothing. We can also reach such judgments with a series of comparisons. If someone dies a slow and painful death, it would have been better, both for this person and impersonally better, if this person's life had ended earlier. The last part of this person's life was worth nothing, or in itself bad. We can reach similar conclusions about the whole of someone's life. If someone's life contains much prolonged suffering and nothing or little that is good, it would have been better for this person, and impersonally better, if this person's life had ended just after it started. Things may be in one way different if we suppose instead that this person's life had never even started. Perhaps we could not claim that this alternative would have been better for this person. But when we ask which alternative would have been impersonally better, there is little difference between these two comparisons. Since it would have been better if this person's life had stopped just after it started, it would also have been better if this person's life had never started. In other words, it would have been impersonally better if this wretched person had never existed. And since such claims make sense when applied to one person, they also make sense when applied to all conscious beings, or to the whole of reality. In considering such wider claims, we can first ask question 1. Q1. Has the past been, in itself, worth it? To focus on this question, we can imagine learning that some massive asteroid will soon hit the Earth, thereby ending human history. We can then ask whether, compared with what has actually happened, it would have either been better or worse if human history had never occurred, because no human beings had ever existed. Of those who have asked Q1, some optimists believe the answer to be clearly yes, since these people are confident that human history up to now has been in itself good, or better than nothing. Some pessimists believe the answer to be clearly no. To some of us, including me, the answer seems less clear. According to hedonistic utilitarians, the past has been in itself good if there has been in the lives of all conscious beings a positive total sum of happiness minus suffering. To explain such claims, we must explain the sense in which some amount of happiness might be greater than some amount of suffering. This sense of greater is normative in a way that is often overlooked. We can first consider grief pains and pleasures. Some pleasure would be in itself greater than some pain if the nature of these two experiences would on balance give us reasons to choose to have both rather than neither. It might, for example, be worth enduring intense cold on some mountain summit for the sake of seeing a sublime view. When some pleasure is in this sense greater than some pain, these experiences would together give us a positive sum of pleasure minus pain, or as we can say more briefly, a net sum of pleasure. Such claims need more explanations, and should be qualified in various ways. The relative value of such experiences would be very imprecise. Despite these facts, we can often truly believe that some pleasure is greater than some pain. In some longer part of our life, or our life as a whole, we might similarly have a positive sum of happiness minus suffering. That would be true if it would be worth enduring this suffering for the sake of this happiness. We can next ask whether some group of people might together have some net sum of happiness. It may help to suppose that a single person could have a series of experiences that were just like all of the experiences in this different people's lives, and we can ask whether this person would have sufficient reasons to endure the suffering in this super life for the sake of happiness. If the answer is yes, this sum of happiness would again be greater than the sum of suffering. This question is in one way misleading. If we imagine that a single person would have all the experiences in these many lives, we may be led to ignore the distinctions between these lives, or the separateness of persons. When we ask whether human history has been in itself worth it, or on the whole good, we should also consider questions about distributive justice. When someone suffers, this person's suffering cannot be straightforwardly compensated by benefits to other people. If human history had involved a net sum of happiness, which was equally distributed among different people, there would also have been a net sum of happiness within each person's life. And this might have made human history in itself good. But, as we know, this distribution has been very unequal. There have been some people whose lives contained more suffering than happiness, and this fact may have made these people's lives worse than nothing. Some pessimists have been utilitarians who believed that the sum of happiness has been clearly smaller than the sum of suffering. But other pessimists appeal to claims about the world's injustice. These people might believe that, though most people's lives have been well worth living, and the sum of happiness has been greater than the sum of suffering, history has been on the whole bad, because there has been uncompensated suffering in lives that were worse than nothing. As Schopenhauer writes, that thousands had lived in happiness and joy would never do away with the anguish and death agony of one individual. The suffering in these people's lives, these pessimists may believe, would be decisive. These pessimists may not be hedonists. They might believe that even if most people's lives contain great non-hedonic goods, these goods could not outweigh the badness and injustice of some people's uncompensated suffering. On this view, it would have been in itself better if no one had ever lived. Such views, I believe, are too extreme. To consider a simpler example, suppose there have been many wretched people whose lives were worse than nothing, but whose lives were not very bad, since they did not involve long periods of intense suffering. Suppose next that, for each one person who has lived such a life, there have been at least 100 people whose lives were very well worth living. The answer to Q1 would then, I believe, be yes, since the past would have been in itself worth it. The uncompensated suffering of the unfortunate minority would have been outweighed by the much greater happiness and other non-hedonic goods had by these many other people. We have other reasons to doubt these pessimistic views. Though it might be true that past suffering has not been outweighed, such truths are very imprecise. We may also know too little about what has happened. Great suffering was necessary, Nietzsche claims, for all of the things that are good, and all the world's great achievements and glories. That is an overstatement. The building of St. Petersburg involved much suffering, and the building of the pyramids may have involved much more. But such claims may not apply to the building of Parthenon or Venice, and they clearly do not apply to much of the greatest music, art, or literature, such as that produced by Mozart, Mosè, Monet, and Goethe, or as we can plausibly assume, Bach, Rembrandt, and Shakespeare. When I consider the parts of the past of which I have some knowledge, I am inclined to believe that, in utilitarian, hedonistic terms, the past has been worth it, since the sum of happiness has been greater than the sum of suffering. But I also believe that when we ask how well history has gone, these hedonic sums are not all that matter, and that the badness of uncompensated suffering cannot be easily outweighed. I am weakly inclined to believe that the past has been in itself worth it. But this may be wishful thinking. Human history, however, is not yet over. What matters most? Has it all been worth it?